welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Hey everybody, this is the MessianTics talking, and we're just glad to be able to bring an episode to you today. We're going to have a conversation today that's kind of relevant for not just contemporary events, but also looking forward to the future, which again kind of is a common theme with our conversations here. And it comes out of the fact that I was reading an article earlier this week, or late last week, can't remember exactly. But I was reading, and it was talking about the statistics on how many religious leaders in America, particularly in evangelical Christianity, are set to, just based on age and number of years in service, are preparing to retire, and how American Christianity specifically is not quite ready for how many pastors are going to retire over the next 2 to 5 to 10 years. Just because it will be so many all at once, particularly from the boomer generation and the late Xers, that there will be quite a few pastoral roles left without someone filling them. And so it kind of got me thinking, because over the past 3 months now, I've now heard of 2 Messianic Jewish rabbis who had become friends with a local pastor, at least one of them had become friends with a local pastor, who he was asked by this particular pastor who is getting ready to retire, hey, would you take over leading my congregation? And that they became... and they didn't fold them into the Messianic congregation and started meeting on Saturdays or anything. They didn't bring them to the Saturday congregation, but they began to shepherd them as a Sunday church, as a church that gathered on typical Sunday mornings, maybe Sunday evenings, Wednesday Bible study, that kind of thing. Just the standard church schedule. And so my question to myself, and now to Rabbi David, Rabbi Toby, and Rabbi Eric, and to all of you out there, particularly those of you who are in leadership, the question is, how would it look if in the next decade we saw, let's say, dozens of Messianic leaders that are still in leadership or coming into leadership? How would it look if they, in some circumstances, obviously special circumstances, took over and began to also run, maybe not in a super focused way, but as a teaching pastor, or just enough to fill the role until the church could find someone who was trained and ordained in their particular denomination or tradition. If you had dozens of Messianic leaders also leading Christian churches over the next decade, how does that look? Is there something there that is kind of lends hand to the prophetic reality of our movement, that of people who not only who are Jewish coming to faith in Messiah, but people of no Jewish background at all, realizing and embracing the identity of Yeshua as who he was, as a religious Jew. How would that look? So I pose the question to all of you for this discussion.
So I think it's a really intriguing concept that presents both possible great things and possible difficulties at the same time.
Sure.
But I'll look at the positive side first, which is probably not the most common Jewish attitude to take. My normal reaction to everything is I look for all of the possible ways it can blow up first, and then I go to the positive. But that's just the pessimist in me, I guess. But the reality is, the one thing that I see that could be a tremendous benefit in a model, not that it's a model, but in a model like that, would be the ability to further impact the restoration of the Jewish identity of the promised Jewish Messiah among the greater body of Messiah. You know, if you're leading a Messianic Jewish synagogue, I mean, we all kind of feel the effects of this realistically. A Messianic Jewish synagogue, for lack of a better way of wording it, is in essence a niche market. You know, you're not necessarily going to go, and you can, but you're not necessarily going to get the same response doing a door knocking in neighborhoods for a Messianic synagogue as you would get for, you know, a local Baptist church or evangelical charismatic church or something. You know, you're not necessarily going to get the same response and reaction off of mass mailing as you would for a large evangelical church or something along those lines. It is realistically kind of a niche market. People that are looking for it will find it. People who have a hunger for it will ask questions, and so on. But in an environment like that, especially one where they share a building, because this is my experience with those that I know that are in this situation, is they use the same building. So on, you know, Saturday morning will be the Messianic Shabbat service, and on Sunday morning will be the church service. But it's the rabbi leading both, and in doing so, he's able to teach from a Messianic Jewish perspective in both environments. Now. Right. With that comes the complication of needing to recognize that Messianic Jewish language isn't necessarily going to work quite as well in a church environment out the gate. You know, you kind of got to build to that if you're going to attempt to.
Right.
But so I could see a tremendous opportunity for influence for the restoration of the Jewish identity of the promised Jewish Messiah upon the greater body of Messiah by doing such. And if we're honest, I can also see the potential for the increased income for the rabbi having two congregations that are in essence tithing and he gets paid off. I mean, just looking at the practical side, not to make it about money, but that is a practical reality. You know, a lot of Messianic rabbis, you know, the congregations are small or what have you, and they're bivocational, trivocational, whatever. It could be a way to allow for more active full-time ministry and be able to minister to more people all at once. So there is a uniqueness to that I could see a really positive characteristic and outcome from. I will say my hesitancy, and I don't think that, not that I've heard any of the handful that I'm aware of that do this say that this has been a direct impact that they've experienced, but my hesitancy would be that one of the major outcries that we get from the traditional Jewish community about Messianic Judaism is they say that we're a wolf in sheep's clothing, that we're just Christians posing as Jews for the opportunity, to kind of trick Jews into thinking that they're still within Judaism, but really converting to Christianity. And I think my hesitancy would be, is leading both a Messianic synagogue and a church at the same time, is it going to feed into or amplify that false stereotype and that distrust that the traditional Jewish community already kind of has in the Messianic Jewish movement? Right. I'm not sure if it would or wouldn't. Yeah. But that's an honest hesitancy that I see.
It's an honest question.
Yeah.
My of course my go-to response is like, well, you know, we're not as if it changes our legitimacy in any way, regardless. You know, because, you know, for example, I was explaining to a family member, you know, typically within the normative Jewish world, whatever that means, we tend to get more problems, and we tend to be hated more by non-religious Jews, or, you know, typically in the Reform camp, than almost anyone else. Because, and not to say that we don't have our problems with the Orthodox. You know, the Orthodox obviously cause problems for Messianic Jews, and especially in places like Israel or in Jerusalem. But, you know, the Reform here, it's, you know, which is kind of funny to me, because like some of you don't even believe in God.
Yeah.
You know.
Or the legitimacy of the Word of God,
or any of it. You know, you just you see people with the name Jesus, Yeshua attached to talits and kippas, and you get angry.
Or as Ben Shapiro calls them, Ginos. You know, you got your rhinos, they're Republican in name only.
Oh, gotcha.
He calls them Ginos, they're Jews in name only.
Yeah, I mean it's true. So I don't know. It's a good question, because I can see, I can definitely see how it could bring more harm. but at the same time, it's like, well, we're losing. It's a lose-lose anyway. So are we really? Are they bringing more harm, or are they just beating the dead horse more?
So I don't mean to like dominate the conversation early, and I promise I won't moving forward. But actually, you talking just then, what you were saying made me think of realistically a very logical counter to my hesitancy. If we're honest, and we try to be on this show, right? We try to point out we're called the MessianTics for a reason, because we're dealing with the craziness, the antics, the things that aren't necessarily 100% right within Messianic Judaism that we'd like to help mold a better future for the movement and so on. But to that end, if we're honest, Messianic Judaism hasn't been the most effective at reaching Jewish people. Now, I have my personal thoughts on why that is, and I'm not going to get into that in this episode. We've talked about it previous, but nonetheless, we aren't necessarily the most effective, but the church is very effective at reaching the Jewish people. And it could be, where I said that my hesitancy would be in whether the Jewish world would simply go, this is fodder for the fire of wolf in sheep's clothing argument. But the reality is would we have a better opportunity to share Messiah with Jewish people in the church side of that ministry, who then could, at some point, as the Lord puts it on their heart, mold into the Messianic Jewish community. It's something I hadn't...
become and also continue to live as Jews.
Correct. Yeah. And the reality is when you brought this idea up the other day, I hadn't thought about that. My initial instinct, like I told you earlier, initial instinct was a hesitancy. Because again, my brain... I'm going to go for, how does this blow up in our face? Like, what piles are we stepping in if we do this, before I can get to, here's something that'll work.
Big, stinky ones.
Exactly. But that could be a huge positive. Like, if you were doing a pros and cons list to figure out if it was the right way to go or not, that would be a pretty substantial pro, is that the church effectively has been much better. Even since the birth of the modern Messianic Jewish movement, the church still has been much more effective at reaching Jewish people.
It's almost like, it's kind of ironic, because, you have like so many Jewish believers who, we'll even meet here, who even like occasionally come for holy days here, who have been lovers and believers in Messiah for years. Have attended a church faithfully for years.
And still do.
And they'll come to Yom Kippur or to, Rosh Hashanah.
Do the things that Jews do.
Right. But then that's it. Like their lives and their community is in the church world. And, and ironically, the Messianic Jewish world seems to draw in more Gentiles than it does, Jews. So I don't know if there's something there, and I'm not trying to get away from the original question and conversation, but that's part of it, I think. Yeah,
and I think that the organic reality of a conversation like this is, where does it lead to? You've got to look at all possible avenues that we can contemplate and really wrestle. I mean, I talked about this the other day. I think I may have talked about it on Saturday. I don't remember. But I talked about this the other day, that the word Israel, Yisrael in Hebrew just simply means one who wrestles with God. Right? And that is at the crux of the Jewish understanding, not very literally that we're fighting with God, but we're wrestling with our understanding of who God is, our understanding of our relationship with God, and so on. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's why it's so important that in Judaism, biblical conversation is focused on the question. We always joke, you answer a question with a question. It's focused on the question.
Right.
And so each question presents new questions. So in order to get to some sort of an assumption of understanding, we first have to wrestle with that. And I think that's, you said not to steer this in a different direction, but I think chasing those different avenues, I think the rabbit trails are valuable in a lot of ways, not just because we're all ADD, but...
Sure.
Yeah, I was thinking about...
Did it hurt?
My thoughts about this whole concept, because, like, I've taught in a bunch of different churches over the years, but I was teaching what I believe in the church setting, where I'm not sure how I could myself. Now, I'm not taking away from the calling of others who might be able to do that, but I don't know how I could honestly, without being disingenuous, teach a typical Christian service Christian message with the same kavanah that I would shepherding a flock in a Messianic synagogue. It would be very difficult for me not to feel like, at least in some way, I was posing.
Sure.
And then the questions of why would I be posing? Why would I choose to do that rather than invite those people to come to? And I know it's the sheep without a shepherd thing, but I'm trying to work around this in my mind to see how this concept would work. I know it does work because I know of several rabbis who have a congregation that meets on and then one that meets on Sundays.
Right.
And they've been doing it for years. So there is a method.
Right.
I just don't know how I would personally be able to do that.
Right. And I was talking to my wife about this, Catherine, because I ask her in all ways things wisdom, that I don't think I could never be like a head I could tell them, like, you cannot hire me and expect me to be the head pastor. Like, you've got to look for someone else. But if let's say, and again, this is kind of I'm going to do the Jewish thing, the extreme negative on the other end of this. Like, let's say, it is just like there are no pastors. Like, there are just not enough. And there are, let's say, here in Pensacola, we have quite a few churches. So let's say for out of like 30 churches, you've got 10 without pastors. And again, this is just a guessing number because there's a lot more than 30 churches here. But let's say you've got 30, what we would call Bible-believing churches here in Pensacola, 10 that all of a sudden, overnight, within a 2-year period, just don't have anyone who's capable of leading in a teaching pastoral role. Could I step into... I think I could honestly and genuinely step into a role as a teaching pastor, where I show up on Sunday, I make sure the service goes off without a bang, but where most of the activity, most of the execution of the service, at least in just regards to the service of the church, is executed by its elders and its deacons, whereas I could get up and prepare a message and a teaching and it would be genuinely messianic, genuinely from me, and not watered down in any way. I might change some of the language some, just because that's what people are, like if I start talking about Shekinah, that most people,
right.
Shekinah, they might know, depending on which flavor of church it is. But I might have to change some of the language, but the heart, the intent could remain the same. But I don't think I could personally, I could never be a Southern Baptist pastor. I could be a teaching pastor that is there temporarily to aid in keeping the community and the body together, to hear teaching from the Word of God at least once a week in preparation for when they have a pastor, and even help in the search for that pastor. Especially if it's let's say I'm in my
kind of a stopgap, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. But think about that. If you had a bunch of Messianic rabbis as stopgaps in the church world for, let's say, just a couple years, think about the teaching, from a thoroughly messianic way of viewing the Bible, of viewing Scripture, of viewing Yeshua, how much impact that could have for generations to come.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, I just was that. Well, how widespread is? I know you read this article. I just, this is what Rabbi Jonathan read. This article. My first question when you told me about the article was, how widespread is this?
It's expected to be at least America-wide. So across the U.S., there's no real demographic that's going to be affected more or less.
This article talked about Messianic rabbis too?
No. It was from the church perspective.
Right.
But the reason we're having this conversation, one is because he brought up, could that bridging the two with rabbi filling the role of both be beneficial? But also, we've had this very conversation about Messianic Judaism on probably no less than 4 or 8 episodes of this podcast so far. And it is
sometimes it takes over other episodes.
I know that there's a widespread. I know that there is an on the horizon tidal wave of a generation of congregational leaders, both Messianic and in the church that are going to retire, and I think there's more of those than there is.
And there's no one, and like most people think, oh, well, we could just have someone step into that role. No, I'm talking about trained and ordained pastors. Like, like, for example, Southern Baptist, young men who have gone to seminary, who have graduated with at least a bachelor's, maybe an MDiv.
And have at least $83,000 in school debt.
Right. No. Yeah, preferably not. God forbid. But like,
no, actually, there are denominations that they will pay your school debt if you get ordained, which is so phenomenal.
And then they bring them in, and they have churches on the other end going, hey, come in, we have a job opening for you, and we want you to train under the senior pastor for 4 or 5 years, and then he's going to retire, and this is going to be your game.
I don't want to shift this conversation into, like David said, earlier when you said you have your certain reasons that you feel a certain way about something, and you don't want to go into it because you don't want to make this conversation about that. Let me say this. For the church, I think that they would have a much easier time filling the shoes of a pastor than a Messianic synagogue, because I think that there's a lot more hurdles or fence lines that people have to get through in the Messianic movement, because you have some synagogues that are like, well, we don't just want a congregational leader, we want a Jewish rabbi.
Right.
And I think that the church is very good with being egalitarian about, we don't care where they come from. I want to say they're better about that. I'm not saying nobody's
right.
perfect.
Well, because that's what the article was. The article was acknowledging that, we have not done as good a job in preparing younger leaders. There's not enough to replace.
I think that there's two issues. I think one problem just the Messianic movement has. And I think it's the issue with, I think that there's a lot more hoops that a candidate would have to jump through to be a Messianic rabbi to fill the shoe, to replace a Messianic rabbi, as we've seen with our own eyes in our time. We there's a lot more hoops. I think one thing that both have in common, and it's the first thing that came to my mind, was that financially, churches and synagogues have a problem. And I think it's harder for Messianic synagogues because they're smaller, and churches have more people, which means they have more money. And I think a real problem is they have to take care of the outgoing guy, and they also have to take care of the incoming guy. And I think some churches, really large, massive churches, can handle that kind of, the ones that, the churches that have like 40 pastors, they have like the pastor over the red solo cups. Like, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand.
You will go to a mega church website. I'm sorry. You go to a mega church website and I'm like, oh, this is the pastor over the hedges in the front of the, okay. What I'm saying is this, because they have money. And yes, they're a big organization. I don't want to get I want to be careful. But I do think that there are some churches out there that are really top heavy.
Right.
And you don't really find that in Messianic Judaism. You simply don't. I hope I'm at least striking some chord. I'm making some kind of sense here.
Right.
But I think a problem is, even for a small church, a problem would be like, well, Pastor Blank is retiring. We need a new pastor. But how are they going to take care of Pastor Blank and bring in Pastor Blank?
Right.
Whereas,
well, that's one area that the church has been much better at than Messianic Judaism, in that most, especially well-established and well-organized, well-run institutions, and I can think of probably 15 churches just in our county alone where CMC is, and you can probably think of just as many, if not more, in this area, that they have, which is something that like our leadership is wanting to build for us at CMC. They have a retirement package built into,
like an emeritus.
Yeah, not even that, just a retirement package built into the salary package for those pastors. If you come into one of these big churches, you've got IRAs that are being paid into, or what 401bs or whatever they're called.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's 401k, there's 403b, I think it's 403b, that's specifically for clergy, that allows for, when you start taking from it, your housing allowance that you were tax credited on, your housing allowance is still tax-free when you start to draw on it.
Right.
I think it's called a 403B, if I remember correctly. But nonetheless, that they have these retirement packages built in. So when that senior leader is getting ready to retire and they're getting ready to bring in a new one, it's not so much they got to worry about how do we take care of the old one to bring in the new one. It's already handled, built into the organizational structure that they've developed. And I actually think, so for me, the reason why I think this is such a valid conversation to have, not just whether or not a Messianic rabbi can fill a pulpit of a church, and I think I see where Rabbi Eric's coming from. Like, can I, with all genuineness, stand on a pulpit of a church every single week and preach? And I think, given the opportunity that they understand, I'm going to preach what I believe to be true. I'm going to teach what I believe to be true from a Messianic perspective, even if I'm doing it in kind of quote-unquote Christian language or lingo, rather than necessarily Messianic lingo. I think as long as they understand I'm doing this from my context, with the hope of establishing or reestablishing the Jewish identity of the Jewish Messiah, I think I can make it work. I'm not saying I want to do that, but I think I can make it work.
I think it goes hand in hand with Paul's idea of, all things to all people. Like, you can relate to another group without compromising. Yeah.
But the reality is, we look at this, and we talked about it in this podcast, that the Messianic movement is in this, and I think, logically speaking, realistically speaking, I think it's a far faster problem in the Messianic movement than maybe it is even in the church world.
100%.
That we're running into this very complication. We've got more pulpits that will be vacated from retirement or from retiring or expiring in the next 10 to 20 years than we have people to step into those pulpits to help lead them. And I think it's a pertinent conversation, because for me and for as a younger leader in the movement, I'm in my 40s now, so I can't really say the young leader anymore, but as a younger leader in the Messianic movement, that's been a battle in my heart for the last 2 decades of ministry, is that we don't have a legitimate standing future leadership-wise, and somehow we've failed at that. Somehow we've missed the boat. But now looking at it and going, okay, wait, no, this isn't just an us problem. This is a body of Messiah problem. The church is being affected by it, which means the entirety of the body is being affected by it. It is not just an us problem. It's a greater, I think, it's a greater statement philosophically, ideologically, spiritually, to the state of the body of Messiah in the 21st century than it is a statement to where Messianic Judaism is in the 21st century.
Right.
I think we have our own problems that sow into it in our own specter, but I think that it's encouraging to some degree to me. It's discouraging that we're finding ourselves in this place, but it is encouraging that it's not just us. I always tell people, Messianic synagogues, it's a niche market. When you come here, a lot of times you feel like you're one of only a handful, because it's just the people you see in your congregation. But then you go to the MJ Messiah Conference, MJ Southeast, or you go to the UMJC Summer Conference, or
Thank God I'm not alone.
Yep, or the Tikkun conferences. You go, oh, I'm not the only weirdo out there. There's more weirdos like me, right? And this is the same kind of thing. Like, okay, this is not something innate to Messianic Judaism, even though it feels like it is, because that's the circles we run in.
Right.
But it's something that is a problem culturally, spiritually, in the body as a whole. How do we then overcome it? Could it potentially, and I'll add a separate question to this that feeds in, could it potentially be that this being a problem, the greater body is or could it play as a catalyst in putting Messianic Judaism at the forefront of the body? If you were to have Messianic rabbis serving not just as stopgaps, but potentially permanently or full-time as the rabbi of the Messianic synagogue on Friday night or Saturday mornings, and then on Sunday, a whole separate church congregation, interrelated, still connected, still one entity, but 2 separate congregations. Could it be a way to restore the Messianic Jewish head of the body of Messiah, if that makes sense? Does it make sense to you what I'm trying to ask there, Rabbi Eric?
Yeah, I understand the concept of trying to bring the Messianic movement to their prophetic place within the body. I'm just, years ago there was a guy who put together a Messianic Bible study, and he was promoting it as a means to go into churches to teach the people in the churches there the fundamentals of Messianic Judaism. And he said, this is a great way for you to go into a church and possibly reap some new members to your congregation. And I said, well, are you telling that to the pastors? Are you up front saying, I'm coming into your church so I can teach this study so that hopefully some of your people will leave your congregation and come to mine?
Yeah.
And so my dilemma in this is, how do I, with fullness of heart, minister to a group of people without saying something like, I know you're here, but I would like to see you here. And because of our convictions and our beliefs that while Messianic Judaism isn't perfect, it is what we believe is right as it's growing toward perfection.
I think this would be an interesting conversation to continue again on a future episode. Not to end this. I mean, I think we still got a lot more we can go through, but to continue to have on a future episode and maybe bring in, there are a handful of people I could think of off the top of my head that serve in similar roles and similar capacities.
How do you do this?
But just to ask those very questions. How do you make this work?
And there's also those that are Messianic rabbis who actually function within a church.
Yeah.
In other words, like Gateway Church has a Messianic rabbi that actually leads a Messianic congregation that is actually fundamentally a part of Gateway Church.
Yeah. So we had a number of years back now. This was probably about 10 years ago. So when we started Congregation Maim Chaim, the building we now own, we were originally renting space there from the church that at that time owned it. And they got to a point, the church had over the years kind of dwindled down, and they really didn't have a sustainable community anymore there. And so they had a pastoral shift trying to bring it back to life. Didn't work out so well. They brought in a belligerent, older, retired pastor. He was in his upper 80s and hard of hearing and very opinionated and, his way or the highway kind of thing. But he was also very anti-Semitic, and he ran us out of the property. And so when we were in a rush, we had like 3 weeks that we had to find somewhere to meet, because when this all went down and some things had happened, some things were said, I just went to him and said, all right, we're going to be out on such and such a date. No clue where we were going to be after that, but this we can't do this, we can't be here. And so we actually had a significant sized church in our area, very near our property now, that we have a relationship with. A very close friend of mine, the senior pastor is, and he actually approached me, and what he wanted to do was to bring CMC onto their property, to give us a portion of ownership of their property. We would be an autonomous congregation on their property, but then also bring me on staff as a staff rabbi with their church in their teaching staff. So, the synagogue would be autonomous, sharing the property relationally together, but then also be a part of their teaching staff as a staff rabbi with them, or the staff rabbi with them. And it was a very intriguing, we kind of chased the thought down, we wrestled with it a little bit, and ultimately ended up being that their leadership, their elders decided that, or their board decided that though they really loved the idea and wanted to be a blessing to us, that they could not in good conscience put us in that position, and then without knowing, because they were growing rapidly, still grow rapidly, without knowing what the future was going to hold, and if there was going to come a point in time where they would not be able to house our Shabbat service.
Right.
And so they said, look, we love you, we don't want to harm relationship, but in good conscience, we can't put you in a position that we don't really know what a future would hold in that scenario if we were to do this.
Right.
So I fully respected it, but it was a really intriguing thought, and it would have been kind of like what Gateway does, in that it would have been a Messianic rabbi, like Rabbi Eric was saying, Messianic rabbi on staff and teaching and doing things, but also the autonomous separation of our congregation as its own existence on that property too, which was a really intriguing thought and something that was very interesting to have had. And if it had happened, it would have been a God thing either way.
Right. But, and that opens up another theme, is that there's so many, if something like that were to occur, there's so many Messianic congregations that are looking for spaces. If let's say the only hope of a church surviving financially is to bring in a congregation, and you have the negotiating power to say, we want to do, both of us are here, kind of together, but also kind of autonomous. It might Messianic congregations who are right now renting front office strip mall spaces to worship in to actually get a building that is built to be a house of worship set apart from, not near TJ Maxx or whatever. So.
Yeah, we had an interesting situation at Bridham a few years ago before we bought our current building, and that was that the local conservative synagogue had contacted us and asked us if we were interested in buying their facility, because they had dwindled down in numbers and they couldn't afford their building. And what they wanted to do was for us to buy the building and then rent them back their smaller sanctuary, because they have a big sanctuary and a smaller one,
right? And
allow them to continue to meet on Saturdays in the morning as their congregation, but we would own the building. So fundamentally, there would be a conservative synagogue and a Messianic synagogue worshiping in the same facility at the same time, which was again another unique twist to this. How do you do this?
You'd almost have to go, I need to see the full Amidah that you're going to be doing in your service every week to make sure that we're not working against each other entirely. But
right.
But no, I remember when you guys had that on the table, it was a really intriguing, and it almost happened. It came really close to.
Right. Yeah, so it's, these things happen around where unique situations arise that you have to walk through and talk through and get through these different things. We have a Lutheran church that rents from us right now, and we have a Methodist church that contacted us this week that's splitting from the United Methodist Church, and they want to possibly rent our building in the afternoon on Sundays.
Yeah.
And so we would have a Lutheran church, a Messianic synagogue that is renting our building to a Lutheran church
and a Methodist
church.
Yeah,
both of whom are denominations that haven't always necessarily been friendly with the Jewish people.
Right.
Right, and both of those congregations left or are leaving their home organization because of fundamental Bible truths that they hold to
for righteous
that their
reasons.
Home organization no longer does.
Yeah,
right.
And one of those being a support of Israel and its prophetic purposes.
Right. And this is
absolutely.
And we talk about this as being like unique situations, and that's what my question originally is that this is statistically, this is about to become a more common thing. It's not going to be unique any longer. Yeah. It will become, or at least is expected to become, a more common thing that we see happen around the country.
So I don't know that you've actually shared, Jonathan, your thoughts on how you could picture if it were to happen. For instance, if you were in that position, if you were a senior rabbi being asked to then also take over as the senior pastor of a church, how would you picture that potentially playing out?
Yeah, I think I hit on it a little bit a minute ago about, I've been talking to Catherine, my wife, about it, because I was really running it over in my mind, because I took the article to heart. I was really like, wow, this could be the reality of life in the next 5 years. That, I know for a fact I could do like a teaching pastoral role. Like I could come in, it's your responsibility to, I'm assuming the church would have some kind of staff, whatever that looks like. But it's your, as deacons and elders, it's your responsibility to make sure the sound is working. Worship team is, ready to lead worship, and I can communicate with these people just to make sure they're doing it. Kind of like, we've talked before about, military experience, because I've had military experience, and, disseminating, tasks according to that command structure, that each person has their roles, and like, I'm not going to micromanage. Like, I'm going to be like, okay, is the worship team all set to go? Sound crew all set to go? Is the, deacons and elders, y'all are set to do, are the ushers, are y'all set to do whatever you're going to do? And I could come in and I could, be there to see through the execution and then to teach and to give a message that again would be thoroughly messianic in its heart and its intent. Again, sort of prune to so that way prune to not have so much Hebrew. So that way, because most people, especially in those kind of churches, they're just Hebrew is not going to be something.
Right. My question, and I think I could do like Rabbi Jonathan is talking, and I think Toby or Rabbi David, Rabbi Toby, or Jonathan, all of us could go in and teach at a place for a period of time, filling in. My question comes, for instance, when it comes to holidays, like none of us would have a real problem with Oktoberfest.
Right.
But
or Thanksgiving.
When it came to
Christmas
Easter or Christmas,
right.
How are you going to deal with those?
That's true. That is very intriguing.
That's a good point.
But
that is a problem.
It's a good question. And again, that would be a situation where I would have to pass it off to the elders of the church, the deacons, and be like, if y'all want to have Christmas decorations, y'all are going to have to set that up. Y'all are going to have to organize that. But I'm not.
Or teach on it. Even have somebody teach on it to make that stretch, because I just
right, because my messages around that time of year are going to be more Hanukkah related, probably. They're going to be in line, probably with the Torah portion. Like that would be what we would work out of, whatever the parsha is for that week. At least that's what I would be working out of. And we would encourage that reading during the week. Be like, all right, because there are churches that put out bulletins, weekly bulletins of like, here's, and I could do that. So that's a good question. But again, things that would have to be navigated. For sure, but I'm also, I have confidence in my navigable activities.
But see, you bringing that up, Rabbi Eric, it actually kind of reiterates what I was saying earlier, that it'd be really intriguing, not combatively. I really am curious how it works. Because I've always looked at, for instance, Jonathan Cong, Rabbi Jonathan Cong has a congregation that has Friday night services and Sunday morning services. Right. And the Sunday morning is, from what I understand, kind of traditionally dealt more as a church than it is a Messianic congregation per se. Though obviously he's a Messianic rabbi, so there's a Messianic slant. But and he's done it that way for decades, right? Rabbi Frank Sussler, who, if memory serves, leads a Messianic synagogue on Shabbat and a church on Sundays. As a matter of fact, I think you've actually spoken in his congregations before, right, Rabbi Eric?
Right. I've spoken in both the synagogue and the church.
Yeah. So I would be really intrigued to have a conversation with one or two or however many of the guys that do that. Just ask us when Christmas and Easter, and again, in Messianic Judaism, the four of us here are not necessarily the biggest fans of Christmas and Easter. We don't have I don't get upset that believers celebrate them, because I understand and fully believe that their heart is in the right place. It's just on the wrong day, and that is what it is.
Right. Yeah.
But I don't personally celebrate Christmas and Easter. There are those within Messianic Judaism that do, and that's fine. There's people within our own congregations that do, and that's fine. I don't police that. I don't teach that they shouldn't. That's between them and God.
Right.
I teach what I believe to be the case, and this is where we go as a congregation. But in that perspective, how do you handle these things? If something like this arises, when Christmas rolls around, what do you do? How do you? Because I remember when we were renting space as a congregation from a church. Every year when Christmas rolled around, there was 18, 20-foot Christmas tree in the sanctuary, decked out with lights and decorations and all. And we're like, well, crap, how do we hide that during the Torah service so it doesn't look weird? I remember, Rabbi Eric, you remember when we planted the congregation that used to be in Foley, and we were using that Episcopal church, and when we started there, they had this monstrous, it had to have been like a 25-foot high cross on the wall behind the stage, and it was huge.
Yeah.
We never said anything about it. We never complained about it. We never said, hey, you need to hide this, right? But we showed up for that you remember this, Rabbi Eric? We showed up for that very first service, and they had built this giant thing that very lightweight, we could pick up and hang over top of the cross, so that instead of seeing the cross, you just see what looks like a giant speaker up there. And they did that out of their own kindness of their heart to put that up. That wasn't anything we asked for. It wasn't a complaint that we made.
Right.
Messianic synagogues meeting in churches, we recognize it as a church. It's going to look like a church. Some things are going to feel like a church. That is what it is.
Right.
But when you're the leader of that, how do you navigate when those issues arise in that manner? That's I really would be intrigued to have that conversation.
I think it would make a great episode to invite maybe Rabbi Frank or Rabbi Brian,
who's just stepping into that.
Just stepping into that role, and if we could get Rabbi Jonathan Cong to come on. That would be because all three of them are different dynamics in the same.
Yeah, and at this time I really couldn't answer like how would I do it? How would I handle being a senior?
And I mean, we're all theorizing anyways.
Oh, sure, it's all hypothetical because that's truthfully, like if they were like, could you be like for the remainder of your years be the lead pastor? Like, I could make hospital visits. I could do funerals. All of those things I could do. But when it comes to the lead guy, I'd be like, I just don't think I could, honestly. I would have to be like, let's do a sit down in January. Let's sign a contract. I'm with you for the year. We'll sit down and reevaluate come next January.
Now, if a church approached me and said, would you be willing not to leave your congregation, but to come on staff part-time or whatever with our church as a staff rabbi, as part of our teaching team, would you be willing? Like, dude, I could work that out. That wouldn't be a complication.
Right.
There is a whole different, and I think that's the whole point of this, there's a whole different discussion to being the senior leader of both.
Right.
But at the same time, it is a very pertinent conversation. Right. We've had the discussion before, over and over again, about this reality that Messianic Judaism will have empty pulpits in 10 to 15 years everywhere. I just had this conversation with some union leaders recently that in the next 15 years, 20 years, what we know is the Congregational Messianic Jewish movement may not exist, in at least as we know it, if some things don't change rapidly because of this very problem.
Right.
There are too many pulpits that will be empty and not enough bodies that are willing to fill them.
Right.
How do we overcome that? How do we remedy that situation? And if it's a greater body of Messiah issue, how do we remedy for ourselves? How do we model that remedy for the church? And if this is an avenue that God opens up for some Messianic rabbis, is that a way to remedy it between both worlds? I don't know. I joked around at the beginning, we answer questions without questions. I think we have far more questions now than we even began with in talking about this. But I do think it's a very valid conversation. It's one that I would really be interested in knowing from those that actually do it. How does this work functionally?
It's very intriguing.
Yeah. It's definitely something to think about, and when I heard when Jonathan brought up the topic, I was like, that's something I need a long time to think about before I could say anything, because you have to take into account that while we're part of the same body, that the church and the Messianic movement are
vastly different.
And with different issues. Some things in common, there's a lot of overlap. And even with the problems that overlap with churches and Messianic, as I mentioned before, even with those problems that overlap, the Messianic movement and the church handle them so differently.
Right.
Again, going back to what I was saying about just simply replacing a senior leader who is retiring. Replacing is, I don't mean that in a negative word, but I'm just saying when someone steps down or retires.
Right.
With the Messianic movement, there is a lot more things that are considered, some I think that are important and some that I think shouldn't be part of the considerations, but they are.
Right.
And but that would be getting into discussions that we've had, many times over, and I think that we'll continue to have because I think it's important, but,
Yeah, I think they'll reappear from time to time. I don't know, man. I'm not that I'm sold on this is the way it has to go.
Right.
But it does spike a bit of interest that I really want to explore it more.
Yeah,
not in the sense that I want to go do it, but I would explore the functionality.
If I actually got approached with the same question, I would be like, I would have to pray about that and really think, because I've like all of us, I've got a lot on my plate, and I'm like, could I prepare a second message, a second teaching and during the week, and also be able to minister to the souls of the people, a whole other group of people.
I'll tell you this, just let's flipping the situation. I'll tell you this. When I was in Macon, and I had not been going to, and it was Beth Yeshua in Macon, I had not been going very long, and the rabbi there, the rabbi in Macon was he fell ill, and he's fine now. You know, God totally healed him and stuff. But what I'm saying is that he had a major life-threatening illness and was out for months and months and months. And I remember when we were renting from a church at the time, before Beth Yeshua got its own building. It has its own building now. But we had the pastor of the church come over and do teaching, and that was rough. I'm going to be honest with you. So it's interesting. I'm just simply saying we're putting from this perspective, like a Messianic rabbi coming into a church, and we think about how that would be received and how that would be done. But then I think, well, man, if someone from a church came over, I think you would have a lot of people. It's interesting because I've spent time in both worlds, and you and I have too, Jonathan. We've spent a time, and it's interesting how I think that you would have some people who would be like, fine. But I think you would have a lot of people who would be like, hey, man, I'm at a Messianic synagogue for a reason.
I will add to that I think, now that you bring that up, that's another good point, is that I will say that I think Messianic teaching is better received in churches
than
church teaching is received in Messianic
and I think that's
synagogues.
An important point to think about.
And with that, we all get invited to speak in churches, right? And we understand that we're invited to speak as Messianic rabbis. So there's an assumption on the audience's part of where we're coming from when we speak.
We're built different.
But we still communicate those messages in a way that they can grasp and understand, right? And so, but that's an area, and I think part of the reason why maybe it wasn't so cohesive there is because the Messianic movement, and I hadn't really thought about this before either until this conversation. We're really happy when churches invite us to come speak, but how many of us actually invite pastors to come speak at our congregations?
I think that, it's what I'm saying, and just not to interrupt, but I'm saying it's this interest. It hit me at the very. I know we've been going for 50 minutes, but I'm saying it didn't hit me until I listened to this whole conversation. I'm like, wait a minute, let's flip this. Because I've been talking with one pastor friend of mine, real good friend of mine, that I actually want to come speak at CMC in the next couple of months, and so I'm hoping to get him on the book soon. But I know, Rabbi Matt Rosenberg in Seattle at Restoration has had over the last 8 years or so some pretty substantial medical things, diverticulitis, a few other things that have kept him out of his pulpit for weeks at a time. A couple of years that it had. I mean, not like he wasn't out of the pulpit for several years, but over the course of a couple of years, a month or two each time, and but he's got some really phenomenal relationships with pastors in their area. That's exactly what he does when he needs somebody to come in. He's got pastors that he invites to come and speak at their congregation, and they come in as pastors. So the congregation has the assumption they're going to communicate in the way that they communicate, but they're preaching a message that isn't particularly a quote-unquote church message. It is a Messianic affirming message, but they're preaching it from their way. And so it is very well received because there's that relationship there where they're already communicating and know how to communicate. But yeah, you're right. And I'm not even looking at would a Messianic synagogue be able to survive if you had a pastor fulfilling both pulpits on a regular basis, but just on the occurrence of bringing guest speakers in. How often do Messianic synagogues? I've never had a church pastor come in as a guest speaker at CMC, not because I'm not open to it, because until the last year or so, it wasn't anything that even registered on my mind. I'm super happy when a church says, hey, come take my pulpit for the week. But do I return that blessing and that favor and give people an opportunity, the rest of the body opportunity to sow into our community and so on? Man, that's come out with more questions than we do answers. But Rabbi Eric, have you ever had pastors come in? I mean, because Brett Allen's been around for a while, so
and you're old.
Yeah, we have.
So what is the?
We have.
Okay.
We've had several pastors come in over the years.
How does
came and some who have connections, like Raleigh, Washington, is a pastor. We had Coach McCartney come; he was a pastor. We've had others that come, but they understood the Messianic vision to some extent, so they could tailor their message in the same way we do. When I go to a church, I tailor my message to that church, not just giving the same thing I would get on Saturday. I find this whole conversation really important, and partly because if, in fact, as the article that Rabbi Jonathan read and showed us is true, that over the next 5 or 10 years, these possibilities are going to present themselves.
Yeah.
I think it's important that we have this actual discussion now, rather than waiting 10 years and then trying to figure out the what's and whys and whens and why-fors of the possibility.
Yeah. Well, I think that some of that attitude, like with, again, this is probably for another episode. I'm just saying, just a tidbit here. I think, let's just imagine this. You go to a church. We go to a church. And after church is over, we go to lunch. We go to a restaurant. Just pick one. I don't want to say one because I don't want to be like, oh, you know. But let's just say we all go to lunch after.
In the old days, we'd all go to the buffet after church.
Okay, so we all go to the buffet. But let's just imagine. Okay, so wherever. We go to B's or whatever. But we go there. If a group, everybody, now, hear me out. This is true. If a group from a church, from our church, we'll all go to a church, all 4 of us. And let's go to lunch, guys, after service. We go to service, and let's say a group from another church also goes, and we hear them talking about maybe the message. We hear them talking about Jesus. Chances are I'm not going to go up to them because, it's understood. But let me tell you something. Me and David went to lunch after a recording day here, and we had our sit-sits on. We went to lunch, and these 2 Israeli guys came up to us. The Jewish people, there's even in the Messianic movement is what I'm saying. There's this, I still think, and I think it's the difference between Jewish culture and non-Jewish culture. And with Jewish culture, there is, even in Messianics, which, Messianic Judaism still evangelistic and outreach-oriented because of the gospel of Yeshua. But they're still, being Jewish, there's still, within a Jewish community, there's still an insular attitude a little bit, like almost like a tribal attitude, right. Because, like I said, I don't go up to, when we were at church and I saw other Christians from another church, I didn't go, oh, hey, are you, but you wear your sit-sits out, you might have a Jewish guy come up to you, like when my mom went to Party City and went to the Hanukkah section, and a lady went up to her, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish too? You guys follow what I'm saying?
Right, yeah.
So, yeah, highlights. So I think that there's, when we flip the script on what Jonathan was talking about, I think there is, even in Messianic Judaism, there's almost like a bit of an insular attitude where, like, we're willing to go out and go to a church, but, like, bringing them in, it's kind of like,
Yeah.
No, you're right.
I feel like this is going to have to be not just another episode where we talk with those that have served in both functions, but I think that brings up a whole other episode's conversation in and of itself, is how do we better extend legitimate two-way mutually beneficial relationships to the greater body of Messiah. Because like we've all said, we're all more than happy to step in a church pulpit and preach.
Yeah. Right.
But are we truly mutually benefiting one another?
Right.
Because I think there's a big, again, like with the iceberg, I think there's a lot of reasons why, and there's a lot of big reasons why, and they're understandable why there is that attitude in a Jewish community versus a non-Jewish community. So
yeah.
All right, well, we're going to wrap this up, but obviously this conversation is not done. We will be having more of this, I'm sure. Rabbi Eric, did you have anything to add before we close out?
No, I'm just sitting here cycling through thoughts in my mind that I had never previously really considered.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So yeah, this will definitely be a ongoing conversation, both on and off air, I'm sure, between the 4 of us, and hopefully for those of you listening as well. And we will hopefully get a few interviews to go along.
And as you listen to this episode, like I said, we're coming out with more questions than we walked into this conversation with. If you've got questions or thoughts that you want to add to this conversation, drop those in the comments, whether you're listening this, wherever you're listening this to at, and then also, send us messages on social media or what have you, so that we can, we'd love to hear your thoughts and how, you're processing some of this stuff. Like Rabbi Eric said, this is, and the same for me, some of this is stuff I've never really put much thought into. Right. And, I think it's important, especially that latter part. Are we truly being mutually beneficial in the body?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we all realized that during the episode. So
absolutely. All right. Well, we'll see y'all next week. Check below the episode for any links or anything that were maybe pertinent to this episode, and we will see y'all next week. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.